Hey guys, I hope everybody's doing well. We're going to continue with this factoring idea that we started. We're going to move on to another technique. So far, we have three techniques that are in our, so to speak, tool bag. We have looking for a greatest common factor, which could be a monomial or a binomial that we're looking to factor out of the given polynomial. We also learned how to factor type 1 trinomials where a is equal to 1. So what that means is that you have a polynomial that has three terms and the leading coefficient is 1. So today we're going to look at when we would use factor by grouping. Okay, we're going to review a couple concepts here. We're going to look at factoring out this GCF here of what we just talked about. Here I have I'm looking at two terms because of the addition symbol, and I can see here that I have a common factor of x plus 3. So I'm going to factor out x plus 3 out of the first two terms. Here, once I factor it out, I'm left with an x. Here I'm left with a positive 8. And now we are complete here because we're looking at two factors. Remember, things are factors that are multiplied, so we know that we're done. Okay? Here's an example again to save on time. We would do the same thing and we would be finished. Okay, so taking a look at these problems down here, factor by grouping problems, how do we know that we're going to factor by grouping? If we look at each and every problem that we have down below, we would see that every single one of these polynomials has four terms. Okay, so if you notice your polynomial has four terms, one technique that you might want to try using is factor by grouping. All right, so what we're going to do here with this polynomial is we're going to group the first two terms. We're going to group the last two terms. Okay, notice that in between them, this positive actually belongs to the x plus c. So the x plus c is positive in this case, and we always do want to have an addition sign that's in between these two binomials. After we group the first two terms, we look for a greatest common factor, which would be x. If I take out an x, x plus 3 would be left. Now I'm going to do the same thing to these next two terms. The third and fourth term, I'm looking for a greatest common factor, which is z. So I'm going to factor out a positive z. And what's left there is x plus 3. And now we can look and see, okay, I have a common binomial in both of those terms. I'm going to factor out an x plus 3, and what's left is x plus z. And this is factored form. These are two binomials that are being factored, and I am finished there. Okay, we're just going to look at a couple more that are actually can present a couple different issues and things that you need to think about when you're factoring by grouping. Okay, we notice here I have four terms, so we're going to try to factor by grouping, and notice that the third term is negative, and that actually belongs to the 14ex. So I'm just going to take a second when I'm going to rewrite this in terms of grouping. Okay, that negative I'm going to put with the 14. So that means there's now a plus here. Okay. And now I'm ready to start the process. So if you notice, we just rewrote the given polynomial, particularly the third term, as adding a negative, which is the same as subtracting. Okay, so we're going to continue here. I'm looking for a GCF in my first two terms, which is 5x. When I factor that out, I'm left with 2x minus 3b. And when I look for a GCF in my next two terms, notice my leading coefficient's negative. So if you remember back to our first lesson on factoring, GCF, we said if the leading coefficient is negative, we're going to take out a negative GCF. And we're going to take out a negative 7e. And that would then change all the signs. So this negative 14 would become a positive 2, also leaving an x. And this positive 21 is now going to become a negative 3 and leaving us with also the b. And if we look here, we could see I have two common binomials that I'm going to factor out of this. And what's left is 5x minus 7e. Okay, so there's a slight variation here with this third term being negative. We do have to make sure we handle it the right way so that we're factoring out a negative GCF, which will affect our factors in the long run. Okay, let's take a look at a couple more. Okay, again, we see that this third term is negative. I have four terms here, so we are going to try to factor by grouping. So I'm going to group my first two. I'm going to replace that negative with a positive, and that negative is going to go with the x. Okay, so now we start the process. I look for a GCF in my first two, which would be y. That leaves us with x plus 2, and now when I go to find my GCF of my second two, notice the leading coefficient again is negative. I'm going to take out a negative 1. Now all that's going to do is change the signs, and now I have a common binomial that I could factor out. Okay. So let's keep up with these. We've got a few more to do. You're going to see some things are definitely going to change as we go through, as they normally do. All right, we go to group the first two. I'm going to replace that with a plus. And now I look for a GCF in the first two. It looks like the GCF here would be x. And I go to find the GCF of the second two, which would be a negative 4. And I'm left with 3x minus y. And now we would factor out a 3x minus y. And what would be left is x minus 4. Okay. So a couple more to go. I want to make sure we have enough examples here, and there's a couple things that I haven't seen yet that might come up in the next two that you're going to have to be careful of as you do this, okay? All right, and here we go. Okay, 5 and 6 are going to present a new situation here, a new problem. If I think ahead and I go to group my first two terms, what do you guys notice? Okay, if you notice that there isn't a GCF, that's actually the right thing you want to pick up on. Okay, if we were to group these two, our GCF would be 1, and that wouldn't really help us factor by grouping. So what we're going to do is we're going to reorder, okay, this polynomial. I'm actually going to take 10ab, we're going to keep that first, and then I'm going to put negative 6b next to it because I see that there's a common factor I can then factor out. Okay, so I'm going to group the first two. I'm going to make sure there's addition between them, and I'm going to group the last two. And we're going to start the process and see what happens. So if I look at my first two, my GCF looks like it's going to be 2b. I'm going to take out 2b. I get 5a minus 3. And then my GCF in my next two, okay, I could take out a negative 7. But it looks like here I want a negative 3. And if I take out a negative 7, that's going to make it a positive 3. So I'm just going to take out a 7 here. And what we end up getting is negative 3 plus 5a. See, I'm just kind of thinking ahead because I know I want these two to be the same because I need to be able to factor them out. And I think you guys know enough, and we've seen stuff like this before, to know that these are in a different order. 5a minus 3 is the same thing as negative 3 plus 5a. So now I can factor out my common factor, and what's left is 2b plus 7. Okay, let's take a look at one more like that. I've got 4 terms. All right, there's no GCF here, so I'm going to reorder, and you get to kind of choose what order you want to choose. I'm just going to switch these two again. Okay, now I'm going to group the first two. All right, I'm going to factor out q squared. Here I'm going to factor out a 2. I'm sorry, a 5. And now we can see I have my common factor here. Okay, so hopefully you guys found that helpful. I'm trying to keep these videos down to a certain amount of time, and we're just within that time. So I'm going to get this up for you guys. This is called factor by grouping. It's going to work when you have 4 terms, and I'll post this up onto the classroom, and you guys can do the assignment and get it done from there. Hope you guys have had a good weekend, and we'll get started with this stuff soon.